I'm Christopher Clark, Cambridge historian. I was born in Australia. For Europeans, that's practically the other end of the world. But the European continent and its incredible diversity always fascinated me. Even in the far-off country where I grew up, I was always aware that so much of our world has its roots in Europe. And modern Europe is one of the greatest achievements in human history. I want to share the grand saga of this continent, and in the process, I hope to rediscover its wonders for myself. Europe, the very name conjures up images of change, unrest and violence, but the continent has also been an incubator of civilization where wonderful things are created. Florence in the early 15th century is one good example. Florence's ascendancy is reflected in the architecture of its cathedral. The city fathers are aiming high. They want an enormous dome to crown this grand building. No one has attempted such a feat since the days of ancient Rome. They plan to build the largest vaulted stone ceiling in the world. This is one of the most distinctive features of this era. Art, religion, politics and science merged in the great cultural projects of the day. The Medici financed this crowning feat of 15th century engineering not just out of piety, but to celebrate the triumph of their power and that of the entire city of Florence. The Medici family supports numerous artists in this creative environment. One of them would soon become world famous, Michelangelo Buonarroti. Michelangelo creates what is probably the most famous sculpture in the history of art. From a block of the finest Carrara marble, he carves his David. The last time such a monumental marble statue had been sculpted in Italy was over 1,000 years earlier in the days of the Roman Empire. A biblical figure, naked like a Greek boy. It was provocative, to say the least. Other Italian cities are also flourishing. Venice holds trade monopolies for the Mediterranean area. Commercial revenues allow the city to grow into a bustling metropolis. Everything revolves around money. The Venetians are among the first bankers in history. They set up a banco, or a table, where they conduct their business, and they have to make a pledge to the Republic that they will not steal or commit forgery or fraud. The wealth of the Italian city-states fuels the development of European culture. And, as is so often the case, the source of that wealth is competition. In the year 1500, Italy is just as divided as the rest of Europe. City-states compete for power and glory within a very limited geographical area. In Venice, the Doges are the powerful rulers of the Republic. In Florence, the wealthy clan of the Medici are the ones who call the shots. They're among the most important patrons of the great Italian masters. The House of Sforza commissions Leonardo da Vinci to paint The Last Supper. Sandro Botticelli paints his Birth of Venus to order for the Medici family in Florence. And Raphael's School of Athens is created for the Borgias in the Vatican. The largest and most famous work of this era stems from the hands of the Florentine master Michelangelo, commissioned by the papal court in Rome in a bid to assert the papacy's cultural authority in Italy, the ceiling fresco of the Sistine Chapel. This commission required Michelangelo to paint 520 square meters of surface area, all above his head, an incredible feat. He placed full-scale sketches onto the plaster and poked the lines through with nails or spatulas. It took Michelangelo 4 years to complete the ceiling fresco. This is the great era of the image. In this respect, it resembles our own time. But these pictures didn't need a textual gloss. They developed a life of their own. With gay abandon, the artist Michelangelo simply tosses the Old and the New Testament together in a single painting. This fresco by Michelangelo is one of the best-known images in the history of humanity. You can see it just over there in the Sistine Chapel. The finger of the Creator and his human creation almost touch. To depict the relationship between them in this way was not just courageous, it was revolutionary. God and his human creation are depicted here as embodying an equal dignity. What an elevation for humankind. Adam, the first man, confronts us as a confident, autonomous being, and this in a chamber consecrated to the worship of God. Incidentally, Michelangelo himself had absolutely no lack of self-confidence. The papal master of ceremonies, Biagio da Cesena, commented, "It was most disgraceful that in so sacred a place there should have been depicted all those nude figures exposing themselves so shamefully, and that the painting was more suitable for public bathhouses and taverns." Da Cesena had every reason to be upset, among them a personal one, because in the panel entitled The Last Judgment, Michelangelo depicts da Cesena as Minos, judge of the underworld, being bitten in the genitals by a snake. For his David and the figures in his Sistine Chapel frescoes, Michelangelo derives his measurements from real people. But he wants to do more than just reproduce actual beauty. He strives for perfection, like his role models, the ancient Greek sculptors. They also aspired to achieve perfect proportionality in their lifelike statues. The Greeks were perfectionists. They were sharp observers. The precision of their art bears witness to an obsession with mimesis, the precise imitation of nature, the ripples in a dress, the detail of the human hand. But they also strove towards an ideal. In contrast to modern conceptions, they did not think in terms of standardized sizes. Proportionality was the key. How big or tall someone was mattered little, as long as the rest of their body was in proportion. Their aesthetics were mathematical. The ideal face had to conform to specific ratios. The small penis we see on classical figures symbolized masculine self-control. And for women, a well-formed and voluminous bottom was deemed especially attractive. The golden ratio applied to humans and architecture in equal measure. It's as evident in the Parthenon temple here on the Acropolis as it is in the Venus of Milo, the famous statue of Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, love, and sensual desire. Europe has never abandoned this ideal of beauty. You can trace it like a red thread through the entire history of European art. Michelangelo's era takes its name from this rediscovery of ancient art and its celebration of the naked human form. The Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth, but what exactly was reborn? In part, it was the cultural heritage of the ancient world, the essence of what had defined Europe at the beginning of our story. The conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans had triggered a wave of refugees, and among these refugees were scholars who carried with them ancient manuscripts. A wave of enthusiasm for the ancient world rolled across Europe. Scholars from many lands scoured the continent for manuscripts by Greek and Roman authors. Some of these works had quietly spent the Middle Ages secreted in monasteries. Others had come to Spain via the Islamic academies. And now they triggered a profound sea change in culture. Humanist and researcher Poggio Bracciolini also joins in the search.
Come, follow me.
He is determined to find a book from the 1st century before Christ, De Rerum Natura, by the Roman philosopher Lucretius. This book, a didactic summary of Greek Epicurean thought, presents a dynamic analysis of the natural world, completely decoupled from any concept of God.
Maybe here you'll find what you're looking for.
Bracciolini eventually tracks down his quarry in a Benedictine abbey in the German city of Fulda. Lucretius had created a compendium of what we would today describe as natural science. His book comprises no fewer than 7,800 verses, in which he explains the nature of the world and how people can subsist happily within it without the need to fear gods of any kind. The book addresses profound existential questions, and that's why Bracciolini wants to find it. What an interesting and characteristically European synergy between old and new. By shining a fresh light onto the past, one brings into view a new future. Of course, this is only possible because traces of antiquity can still be found all over Europe. Only when you study them more closely, as the men and women of the Renaissance did, does the breathtaking extent of ancient philosophy and knowledge come to light. Knowledge of those hidden forces that hold the world together from inside, as the German poet Goethe would later put it. Writing in Rome 50 years before the birth of Christ, Lucretius described in euphoric terms the fearless, inquisitive spirit of the old Greeks. The Greek philosopher Epicurus, Lucretius wrote, explored with spirit and sense the endless realms of the universe, returned as a victor to teach us what can be and what cannot. Already for Lucretius, then, this was a moment of rediscovery, and 1,500 years later, Lucretius himself would be rediscovered, and with him the entire intellectual dynamics of ancient knowledge. It was a typically European interplay of old and new. Only through the illumination of the past did a new future become visible. For those caught in the cultural vortex of the Renaissance, this really was a rebirth. And yet the question still remains, how was all this possible? Lucretius's book played a role, of course, but another precondition was necessary, one that has always featured prominently in great cultural transformations: a critical mass of talented people, among whom ideas, including some that had been conceived 1,500 years before, could fall on fertile ground and germinate. Renovation in intellectual and economic life, the patriotism of flourishing city-states, and fierce competition for the best tradespeople and artists fueled this tumultuous epoch. Ancient philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle had generated a remarkable fabric of thoughts and arguments, a special kind of mindset. Their reasoning had little to do with sacred scripture. It was founded on the observation of human affairs and the natural world. Men like Archimedes discover that complex phenomena can be accounted for through simple general rules, rules that apply universally in all places and all times without exception. Geometry, invented by the Greeks, sparks a revolution in thinking. Galileo Galilei, the father of modern physics, also follows in the tradition of the Greeks. The universe, that great book, is ever before our eyes, writes Galileo, but the book is written in the language of mathematics. Only through the careful quantification of his observations is Galileo able to discern consistent patterns and to develop his law of falling bodies. This is also the period when the European universities begin their unstoppable rise. Each researcher builds on the work of others across the diverse regions of Europe, creating healthy and exciting competition. Universities like Cambridge lead the way. Once a year, it's possible to experience what a healthy competition between universities looks like at the great boat race between Cambridge and Oxford. It's quite tough, and it's taken very seriously. The two universities regard each other as peer institutions, but they also want to outperform each other. And even today, the race remains a potent symbol of the pursuit of excellence, not just in sport, but in the intellectual arena as well. From the beginning, competition has been one of the driving motors of European history. Life on this continent has been marked by constant rivalry between dynasties, countries, and cities, and soon also between universities and researchers who strove with all their might to discover what held the world together. And here in England, another decisive element came into play: the joy of experimentation, of observing and interpreting the processes at work in the natural world. Italian mathematician Galileo Galilei laid the groundwork, but it's an Englishman who finally identifies and theorizes the mysterious force that brings everything falling to the ground. Isaac Newton, the discoverer of gravity. Was it really the apple that led to Newton's breakthrough? Even today, it seems, centuries after his death, poor Newton can't shake that myth. Here under the walls of Trinity College, there's an apple tree that stems from the original tree from which the apple is supposed to have fallen on Newton's head. In reality, of course, Newton's revolutionary discoveries had less to do with falling apples than with the Bible, which he read every day. Newton owned 30 Bible editions in a variety of languages. That might seem strange to us today, but by then it was anything but. As a scientist, Newton was deeply rooted in the Christian faith and in the conviction that faith and reason do not, and indeed cannot, contradict each other. Why should it not be God who infused objects with gravity? By studying the Bible, Newton also comes to believe that God is not a trinity, but rather a unified force that encompasses the entire world. And this in turn leads him to the idea that time and space are the sensorium of God. Theology becomes physics, and vice versa. But Newton's rejection of the Trinity made him a heretic. For the Church, God was composed of three persons. For Newton, there was no fundamental tension between faith and science. They formed a unity. Observation was the highest form of prayer, and so it seems appropriate that he should be buried in Westminster Abbey, arguably the most important church in the Kingdom of Britain. The inscription on his tomb reads, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night, and God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." This captures something real about Newton's era, an era in which great achievements were still associated with the fulfillment of God's will. This would soon change, and 200 years later, Charles Darwin, also from Cambridge, would shake and remake the world of knowledge. Here he lies, directly beside Newton. Only over millions of years, Darwin proposed, did life on Earth develop into what it is today. The species as we know them were not created by God, but were rather the result of an evolution, a development. It followed that the high apes were our closest relatives. These were scandalous claims. In Darwin's case, it was not scientific observation as such that rocked the foundations of traditional religion, but the displacement of divine revelation by history. It was Darwin, the natural historian, whose thinking transformed the modern world. Since then, Darwin's theory has been confirmed many times over, even if it has failed to convince those who see in the Bible a literal description of the creation. Since the ancient Greeks, the search for a rational explanation for worldly phenomena and their reduction to simple formulae has been the basis of scientific thought in Europe, and so it remains today. The Polish mathematician and astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus observes that the Earth revolves around the Sun. The Italian Galileo Galilei delivers further arguments to support that claim. The Englishman Isaac Newton discovers gravity, and the German Jew Albert Einstein carries on their work with his theory of relativity, a European relay race through the centuries. Since the days of the ancient Greeks, the search for a simple, comprehensive formula has formed the basis of scientific thought in Europe, and it remains so even today. Tidanthropos, tiduk. What is man? What is he not? And of what stuff is the world made? Ancient Greece was the theatre of an intellectual revolution. There were numerous schools of thought, an archipelago of little academies whose philosophers competed bitterly with one another. Some observed and experimented, others searched for philosophical answers. One Greek thinker who stood out for his curiosity and creativity was Heron. 1400 years before Leonardo da Vinci, this engineer and mathematician was already constructing complex machines, such as a vending apparatus that could dispense both milk and wine, a wind-powered organ, and an early precursor of the steam engine. The philosopher Democritus, hit upon the idea that he could, in theory, keep slicing an apple into ever smaller pieces, as I'm doing just here. Could you simply continue doing this forever? Democritus suspected that the answer was no. He thought that one would eventually arrive at indestructible little spheres that could not be subdivided. He called them atoms, with the Greek word atomos, indivisible. 2,400 years later, we're still pushing at this frontier, and we're doing it at the heart of Europe. And here at the CERN Research Center in Geneva, the search inaugurated by Democritus continues. 13,000 scientists from 85 countries hunt for the smallest particle, demonstrating in the process that the ancient principles still apply. You posit a theory, and then you use experiments to test it. And in this place, we are dealing with no less a matter than the basic principles of our universe. This is fundamental science, driven by curiosity alone. The biggest machine in the world is used to study the smallest particles of matter with the aid of an immense particle accelerator some 27 kilometers in length. A tunnel into the furthest frontiers of our understanding, and within it, the fastest particle accelerator in the world.
One time, actually, we had a boat crew in here. They were on the like that, and we out, camera.
What are you trying to achieve with all this machinery?
I think what we try to reach is to answer a fundamental question which mankind ever had. It's the questions, who are we, where do we come from, and where do we go to?
Is there something special about the architecture of public science in Europe that makes this kind of work possible?
I think, yes, Europe is very special. So when CERN was funded in 1954, it was very special that Europeans get together and fund this research. And now, with the European Research Council, this is even more, and it even helps science, fundamental science, even more to do research.
Democritus's apple was a little less expensive. This particle accelerator costs as much as 20 football stadiums and is longer than any Formula One racetrack. Physicists plan to use this machine, the biggest in the world, for just one thing: to find tiny particles. Here in Europe, the door is opening to a new dimension of physics. Partnerships at the European level are nothing new, of course. Galileo Galilei corresponded with his European colleagues, including his young admirer Johannes Kepler, who is particularly fascinated with the moon. And Galileo draws up the very first map of the moon. There's an inscription on this famous Bernini elephant in the center of Rome that says, "Whoever you are, view this monument as a lesson, namely that only a robust spirit can sustain a powerful insight." Which is ironic, because it was just a stone's throw from here, behind these walls, in 1633, that Galileo Galilei was forced before the Inquisition to recant his assertion that the Earth rotated around the sun. He had demonstrated this quite clearly in his Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, a book that until 1825 remained on the Vatican's list of banned texts, although science had of course long proved that indeed the Earth did rotate around the sun and not the other way around. The Renaissance changed Europe and the world in almost every domain, and in the process, entrenched positions of power were often called into question. For a further 300 years, the Roman Church will persist in considering heliocentrism to be a heretical doctrine. The Inquisition forces Galileo to recant his theories, and the Church doesn't admit its mistake until 1992, when Galileo is ultimately vindicated by Pope John Paul II. Galileo's discoveries sparked developments that continue into our modern era. In the 1960s, people landed on the moon for the first time, thanks in part to the expertise of European researchers who developed rocket technology during the Second World War.
4 a.m. Apollo 15 lifted from the pad on its way to the moon.
Walking on the moon would have been impossible for Galileo to imagine, and yet he'd already shown how objects would behave in a world without an atmosphere. They all fall at the same rate, as the astronauts of the Apollo 15 mission demonstrate. These days, our knowledge of the universe is growing ever more precise. We've inherited a learning process that began in Europe 500 years ago. During the Renaissance, people turned their attention not only to God and the heavens, but inward to themselves. One of the most inquisitive individuals of this era can be found in Florence. His name is Leonardo da Vinci. He's already renowned for his many talents during his lifetime. He's a pioneer. Sigmund Freud would later say of him, he was like a man who woke too early in the darkness while everyone else was still asleep. Leonardo designs countless devices, diving equipment, submarines, and flying machines. Most of his inventions must have seemed like flights of fancy to his contemporaries, but in fact he was a man far ahead of his time. Not only is Leonardo a painter and an inventor, he's also a trailblazer in modern anatomy. Leonardo refuses to confine himself to superficial observations of the human body. Over the course of his scientific and artistic career, he dissects a total of 30 corpses. Leonardo's investigations yield new and precise insights into the inner workings of the human body, and his exploration of corpses is a boon to more than just science. It also benefits the art world. Like many of the great masters of the age, Leonardo believes that understanding anatomy is an important prerequisite for capturing the human form on canvas. His most famous work is the painting known as the Mona Lisa, which he starts in 1503 and keeps in his workshop until his death in May 1519, with the excuse that it's not finished yet. Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa is still the ultimate icon. When the 19th century critic Walter Pater contemplated this painting, he claimed to see in it the whole of European history: the animalism of Greece, the lust of Rome, the mysticism of the Middle Ages, the return of the pagan world, the sins of the Borgias. She is older than the rocks among which she sits. Like the vampire, she has been dead many times and learned the secrets of the grave. Pater's words, not mine. But if that really were the case, then the Mona Lisa might well be the quintessential embodiment of Europe. And it's probably the most renowned painting the continent has ever produced. Every year, millions of people come to the Louvre in Paris to admire it. Meanwhile, another capital city dedicates itself to providing down-to-earth entertainment for the masses, a tradition that remains alive to this day. In 1599, London witnesses the birth of a public entertainment venue of a new type: the Globe Theatre. In this circular building, the man who might rightly be called Europe's greatest playwright stages his works. There is a unique artistic synthesis between this theatre and the performances themselves. This is where the city's pleasure-oriented denizens find exactly what they're looking for. What counted as entertainment in those days? Public executions, cockfights and bear-baiting, or mystery and morality plays with devils, demons and allegorical figures. And then along came a man who drew inspiration from these sources, an uninhibited spirit whose genius turned this turbulent world into a work of art. William Shakespeare's plays drove audiences wild, and it's impossible to explain the richness of his imaginary world without understanding the Babylondon of his era, a sprawling city beside a river teeming with courtiers, merchants, artisans, navvies, prostitutes, beggars, and cut-pursers. In Shakespeare's round globe theatre, everything revolved around the full, vibrant, emotionally charged lives of human beings, and the public stood right in front of the stage. Shakespeare's theatre encompassed the whole of human existence. All the world's a stage, says a character in As You Like It, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. The ancient Greeks invented theatre as a cult for their gods. Their dramas were intended to educate the citizens of the polis. Shakespeare learned from them, of course, but his primary goal was to hold a mirror up to society, to entertain his audiences with a vision of the world they lived in. No other dramatist has had such a profound influence on the evolution of theatre across the world. With almost demonic energy, Shakespeare churns out comedies and tragedies. His works illuminate all the lights and shadows of human existence. His writing gives us a glimpse behind the scenes of power, a world of regicide, incest and magic. Plays like A Midsummer Night's Dream, As You Like It, Hamlet, Othello and Romeo and Juliet still move us even after 500 years. Above all, Shakespeare's writing reflects the upheaval and cultural awakening taking place in Europe. His works hold up a mirror to a new age, an age of restlessness in which a process of globalization led by Europe is already in full swing. And the world around London was in flux. Shakespeare was born in 1564, the same year as Galileo Galilei, the man who discovered that the earth was in constant motion, that it revolved around the sun. And Shakespeare too was a transformer. He revolutionized the world of drama and the way stories were told on stage.
A miracle! Here's our own hands against our hearts. Come, I will have thee, but by this light I take thee for pity.
Shakespeare is a courtly entertainer. Queen Elizabeth I is his first patron, and her successor would continue to support Shakespeare's work. Elizabeth I loved the theatre. Before her, it had been the exclusive domain of the nobility. She made it available to everyone. Members of all social classes come together here. On the stage, actors portray peasants, the bourgeoisie, and the nobility, groups that are also represented in the audience. This is a new phenomenon. The new social space of the theatre prefigures the mass entertainment of our own day. Shakespeare was a hard act to follow. But in the following centuries, countless European writers and performers would further refine and expand the spectrum of public entertainment, sharing their own forms of artistic expression with the rest of the world. Berlin's Skladanowski brothers announced one of the world's first public film screenings on November the 1st, 1895. At around the same time, the French Lumière brothers astonished Parisian audiences with their moving pictures. Film begins as a carnival attraction, but this seventh art soon becomes a respected medium, and in the grand Shakespearean tradition, the audience experiences the suspension of disbelief and the rapid alternation of strong emotions. British performer Charlie Chaplin's meteoric rise begins in 1914 with his role as the Tramp. Other European stars, like Marlene Dietrich, also enjoy international careers. It isn't until after World War II that Europe is relegated to second place in the world of the silver screen, behind Hollywood. But Europeans will continue to play a vital role in Tinseltown's golden era as well. Billy Wilder, born in modern-day Poland. Scotsman Sean Connery. Englishman Cary Grant. Austrian Christoph Waltz, and British Kate Winslet are just a few of Hollywood's legendary Europeans. The film industry creates imagery and role models that everyone knows, and many would like to emulate. Spectacle can be a form of mainstream entertainment, a mirror in which society gazes at itself. but it can also be a tool of power, as it was in the Palace of Versailles. All of this is one enormous stage with opulent scenery and props. This was absolutism under Louis XIV. Refinement was an integral part of the courtly repertoire. Elegance was crucial in everything from architecture to clothing. Louis XIV may be the greatest patron of the arts the world has ever seen. Painting and music flourished under his patronage. Representative and monumental styles were driven to excess in the buildings and gardens of the period. Power, art, and craftsmanship joined hands. The court became a culture machine. This is one of the reasons why even today the very name of France is associated with beauty and aesthetic refinement. Versailles was to become the political theatre of its time. The ambitious men and women who jostled for power here were the players. In 1682, the enormous palace replaced the Louvre in Paris as the seat of government, and from then on the royal court, composed of ministers, civil servants and noble families, lived and worked in Versailles, occupying no fewer than 2,000 rooms, which housed up to 20,000 people in all. Louis XIV managed to concentrate his mightiest subjects in a single location, and that's how he controlled them. The Duke of Saint-Simon describes the principle as follows: the king loved splendor, lavishness, and abundance in everything. He deliberately encouraged those around him to give in to their desire to emulate him in every possible way. He inculcated his entire court with this desire. You could earn his favor by spending extravagantly on your table, your clothes, your equipage, your household, and your games. Luxury became a matter of honor. One example of this extravagance is the daily ritual of watching the king dine. In this pleasure-oriented era, dining at the court takes on a whole new meaning. No European court is more important in this regard than the court of the Sun King in Versailles. His table manners, it must be said, leave a lot to be desired. A century earlier, the Italian noblewoman Catherine de' Medici had tried to teach the French proper manners and fine dining. These customs had their roots in Italy. The style of the Sun King's court catches on in Europe. The architecture is especially popular. Local rulers, particularly in Germany, do more than just expand their residential cities. They also build new palace complexes with geometrically designed French gardens. In the later 17th century, many European princes looked towards France with admiration and envy. They also imitate French styles of furniture and clothing. A booming luxury industry springs up around the French royal court, an industry where France still leads the way today. French luxury products become a top export in the 17th century. Anything of French origin is considered the height of elegance. The latest creations are presented on little dolls, the forerunner of the mail-order catalogue. And even back then, items were shipped all around Europe. Fashion-conscious Europeans were already enchanted by France in the days of the Sun King. They adored the refined style inspired by the Vanity Fair of Versailles. It found imitators across the continent. French clothing designs, hairstyles, and even the language were copied throughout Europe. And French terms like haute couture, mannequin, and prêt-à-porter are still used in the global fashion industry today. And in the 20th century, geniuses like Coco Chanel and Christian Dior, with their haute couture designs, elevated fashion to an art form. One thing has not changed since the days of the Sun King. Paris is still the undisputed fashion capital of Europe and the world. The city is brimming with artisanal skills and creativity. Perhaps that's why even today, Paris produces the hottest new fashion trends year after year. Further to the east, in Russia, there's still little trace of this flourishing new culture. Only a handful of nobles are even aware of what life is like in other countries. The opportunity to travel has given them a perspective that extends beyond their own backyard. Peter the Great is one of these privileged few. In 1697, he goes on a grand tour, and it's hardly a solo journey. A retinue of no fewer than 300 accompanies him on his trip across Europe. His journey lasts 18 months and takes him to Poland, Prussia, Holland, England, Saxony, and Austria. His goal is to catch up with the Western powers of the European continent. From the Dutch he learns shipbuilding, and the Prussians teach him the art of cannon manufacture. The English tutor him in finance. Upon his return, the Tsar begins the process of modernizing his country, following the examples set by the European states. And the first thing he does is issue an official decree declaring traditional beards illegal. Peter views them as a symbol of Russia's backwardness. To enforce this ban, he leads by example, and then sends barbers out to shave the masses.
Come in.
There's no escape unless the bearded man acquires an official license for his facial hair. Peter wants to usher in a new era of progress and growth in his backwater empire. He hopes to create a society with Western European standards. He restructures the government, initiates social reforms, promotes education and science. Everything he has seen and learned in the West, he now wants to apply to his own country. Russia also moves closer to Europe in geographical terms, or at least the Russian capital does. The Tsar insists on a capital city with a port and access to the sea, so he turns his back on the traditional capital of Moscow and commissions the construction of St. Petersburg, his window to Europe. You'd never know it by looking at Europe's fourth largest city today, but St. Petersburg got off to a difficult start. The construction site was a swamp, and there wasn't enough stone for building. Peter received hands-on support from Italy, Germany, Holland and France. Italians, Germans and Dutchmen entered Russian service and gave the city its characteristically European face. We can still admire their work today. Peter the Great encouraged his people to look to the West. There was something theatrical about the way he forced his Russians to emulate the fashions and customs of Western Europe. The objective was a comprehensive transformation of Russian life, at least among the upper classes. Wealthy Russians imported every product imaginable, and along with those goods came Western European culture and manners. German merchants arrived, as did Dutch and British engineers, Italian architects, and French musicians and theatre companies. They all blended together in typical European fashion. But this demand, delivered from above as it were, that they should align themselves with the West, divided the Russians. We have two fatherlands, Russia and Europe, wrote Dostoevsky, who also relocated to St. Petersburg. On one side was the enlightened, sophisticated West, with its promise, at least, of progress. On the other, Россия, a little backwards perhaps in some respects, but homely, familiar, and in tune with the spirit of the people. A love-hate relationship arose between Russians and the West, a mixture of attraction and distrust that lingers to this day. Russia's autocratic systems also linger today. First came the rule of the Tsars, then the October Revolution of 1917 ultimately put an end to that, and then came communism. With unimaginable brutality, Joseph Stalin implements a dictatorship of the proletariat. And even under Leonid Brezhnev, the party still determines what people can read or listen to. At the same time in Western Europe, the 1960s, mainstream popular entertainment enters a new phase of expansion. England has been a pop culture powerhouse since the 16th century in the days of William Shakespeare's successful plays. 4 young men from Liverpool also follow in that Shakespearean tradition: the Beatles. The Fab Four have sold more than 1 billion records, making them the most successful musicians in European history. When the Beatles came to Australia for the first time, to my hometown of Sydney, I was 4 years old. I wasn't really aware of it at the time, of course, but the sound and style of the Beatles left their mark on my generation. Only later did I become aware of the Rolling Stones. These were the 2 poles between which pop music evolved in the 60s. On the one side, the Beatles, cheerful, nicely dressed, well-behaved. On the other, the Stones, wild, unpredictable, and darkly pessimistic. Love, 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 versus I can't get no satisfaction. On the 26th of June 1966, the Beatles come to Hamburg on their Blitz tour, and the fans go wild with excitement. This event cemented fan culture as an integral part of European society. The concert is seated, and an effort is made to maintain decorum, but it isn't long before everyone goes crazy. The band and the audience have trouble even hearing the music. "150 years before the Beatles, another kind of musical revolution sweeps across Europe, and this time it starts in Austria and Germany. Politically speaking, early 19th century Vienna is rather conservative, but musically it's in the midst of a revolution. While the delegates at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 dance the same waltzes over and over, Beethoven begins work on his 9th and final symphony. Ludwig van Beethoven, a native of Bonn, finds patrons in Vienna who finance his compositions and his livelihood. This monument in Vienna portrays Beethoven as a sort of demigod. The angels symbolize his 9 symphonies. Just as Renaissance Florence had brought forth painters and sculptors, Vienna became an incubator of musical works of transcendent value. The fact that Beethoven is able to finish what would become his most famous work, his 9th symphony, after nearly a decade, is a minor miracle. By this point, Beethoven is almost completely deaf. He can hardly have imagined the extraordinary resonance that his works would have in today's Europe. The Berlin Refugee Choir, where refugees from Syria, Afghanistan and Iraq sing together with Germans, have made Beethoven's Ode to Joy their anthem. Since 1985, Beethoven's Ode to Joy has been the official anthem of the European Union. On Christmas Day 1989, a month after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Beethoven's 9th Symphony was performed in the Konzerthaus on the Gendarmenmarkt under the direction of Leonard Bernstein, but with a slight change to the wording of the final chorus, which now opened not with the word joy, but with freedom, beautiful spark of the gods. It was a turning point in the history of Europe. And many of those who are singing here tonight have better reason than most to know the value of freedom. That's why they came to Europe, where freedom is a basic right. The European anthem is sung around the world in its original language, in Africa, South America, and Japan. This extraordinary piece of music is the soundtrack to the world's vision of Europe today. And today it's more important than ever that Europe unites in recognizing and acting upon its shared responsibilities to the world.